I would like to welcome everybody to episode 3 of the Iowa Music Archive. We are honored to have Mr. Tom Tatman joining us. Tom is a 2-time member of the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and has had an amazing career, and we're excited to speak to you today about that career. I'd like to start first with just having you tell us about your early life.
Well, I grew up in northwest Iowa on a farm family. I loved growing up on a farm, but I was not a farmer, would never have been one, much to my dad's chagrin. But and that was, I went to high school in a small town called Albert City, which is near a bigger small town called Storm Lake, which is where I met my wife. She went to school there. And in January, we had been married 54 years. So something worked back then. And with as far as the musical part of northwest Iowa, I was fortunate musically to have an older brother and sister. A sister 4 years older than me, a brother 5 years older, and this would have been right at the beginning of rock and roll. So they were right the target audience. You know, my sister dancing with a doorknob. And to Elvis, you know, so, and me being the little brother, you know, they like to pick on little brothers. But what they didn't know is when they were gone, I was listening to their Elvis and Little Richard and Buddy Holly, and I was on Everly Brothers. You might know this. Did you know the Everly, well, obviously everybody knows they're from Iowa, Shenandoah. What I didn't know till recently was they actually went to Longfellow in Waterloo for a year.
I did not know that.
So they could be Waterloo's own Everly Brothers. So I bought a $14 acoustic guitar from Montgomery Ward's. $14, needed a pair of pliers to be able to hold down a string. They were so far off. The first thing I learned was Money, the Beatles cover of that song. Very simple. And then other things like that, like Ventures, you know, things you could pick with one hand. Then I found the Mel Bay guitar book. Oh, chords. Cool. And that's about where I was when I came to college and UNI. And I lived on the first floor of the dorms, Shull Hall. And I'd be in there. By now I have an electric guitar, and don't tell me it's cheap. It was $55. Vox. But so I'd be in there banging in my dorm room, and I didn't know it, but there was this super guitar player that lived on the top floor that had to walk past me every day to go to class, and that was Jeff Peterson, who already was a monster. And he came in and said, "Hey, mind if I come down?" And, you know, and so I think he had an ulterior motive. He wanted a guitar player, he wanted a programmable rhythm player. and so he gave me great lessons. And at some point, we were on our way to class, became roommates. We were on our way to class, and we ran into a drummer, John Long, who he had played with back in his hometown in Clinton. And John said, hey, they're paying bands $300 to play the Union Ballroom, and they just built the student union that year. Why don't we put together a band and make $300? We played the Union Ballroom, made $300, and then we started getting calls to play mixers. That band was called Night Raven. And we started getting calls to play mixers in the dorm basements. And we did that a bunch, and then pretty soon we started getting calls to play country clubs and that kind of thing, and frat parties. And one of the guys I had played basketball and baseball with in high school, who had started the Nobleman, had long since gone to Minneapolis, started a booking agency called Magnum Artists. Somebody told him I was in a band, and he called up and said, you want to play? And so he booked us a couple of gigs, and both wanted us back. And then next thing I know, we're traveling all over 5 states, in a station wagon. So,
and all your gear.
And well, we got a big old U-Haul behind for that.
Okay.
Yeah. So they had big amps back in those days.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So a mutual friend of ours told me a story about music literally saving your life.
Oh, okay. between my senior year in high school and freshman year in college, that summer I worked on pouring cement and building grain elevators. I'd go up like 75 feet high, and then they'd put a platform on it, and the finish work would happen, and then you'd move on to another town. And this one just happened to be in my hometown of Albert City. And so we did that, went on, the Night Raven thing happened, and no, actually, by then we had moved into, made some personnel changes, became Headstone. And we were making good money. And so coming time, the end of the year, school year, and my dad was adamant about me coming back and working on the elevator again. And I was going, I can't afford to. They had to make more money doing this. I think he just wanted me to cut my hair, which by then was on the middle of my back. And so I kind of defied him, and we kept playing. And that summer, that elevator collapsed with my crew on it. And it was pretty hard to wrap my mind around it at that time. It was because I knew all those guys well all summer. But had I done what my dad wanted me to do, I wouldn't be here today. He would never admit that.
Yes.
This is the 60s.
Yes.
There's a generation gap. So
yeah. So you talked a little bit about Night Raven,
Yeah.
and that morphing into Headstone.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe talk a little bit more about what it was like to tour in those days.
Okay. Well, we played a lot. I know in 1971, the friend who had the agency years later stopped in at Catamount, and he said that he was on his way to Kansas City and he wanted to stop in, and he said, I had found this, you might want to see it. And he showed me his booking book, and he said, here's July. And we had played 31 or 30 nights out of 31 days in the month of July. And these are all over, mostly one-nighters and, maybe a couple nights in a club, otherwise colleges, ballrooms, that sort of thing. And actually in that year we had played 300 times, 300 gigs. And the previous years weren't much different. But they were not as many as that. But that was kind of the peak of that version of Headstone's popularity, a lot of ballrooms. It didn't hurt that the drinking age was 18.
Yeah.
You'd go to a ballroom in this tiny town, and you go, why is this great, big, beautiful new ballroom in this town with like 100 people in it? Well, there's no law enforcement. That's why. And the drinking age is 18, so you could have a guy that's like the oldest kid in high school would buy the booze, put it in a brown bag, bring it in, and the ballroom owners would look the other way. As long as you bought setups for $1.50, you had to buy a little Coke to, right?
Yeah.
If they saw you drinking it straight, then you're gonna have to leave or pony up. But that's how that worked. So you'd end up playing for hundreds and sometimes 1,000 drunken 16-year-olds. It was kind of fun, actually. But yeah, there's a lot of that kind of thing. And then clubs, I know sometimes like in South Dakota, we might play a club for 4 nights and then on that Sunday go over to the college and play a gig at the college, which is kind of weird because I figure they were already those kids, but that's how it worked.
So it feels like this is a good time to ask, like, you eventually leave Headstone and start booking bands for this gentleman that you were describing before.
Yeah.
Why did you leave the band and decide to do that?
I sucked. No, I did my job well, but there wasn't a lot of, you could plug any competent guitar player in there and do it. We had the king on the other side of the stage, and I wasn't really striving to want to try to trade licks with him, so I was happy to be his support guitar player. But at some point, I know what the point it was. We were playing the Bank in Cedar Rapids, and during a break, I wasn't singing particularly well that night, and I remember sitting on one of those blocks of cement that what are those called, the curb, sitting on one of those, going, I got to quit doing this. And about that time, I got an offer. Oh, I know. I mentioned that to Doug Smith, the agent, and he said, well, look, if you want to come up here, because I was the guy who always dealt with the club owner, with the ballroom operator, with the student activities committee guys, the guy who got paid. I knew all those people. And so he said, look, I want to get into national stuff. And if you'll come up here and take over the regional stuff, then that would be great. And so then he offered me a salary and the whole thing. And I thought, well, that sounds like I know what I'm doing now isn't what I'm going to be doing 10 years from now. So I did it and made the move. Basically, I had been thinking for a long time that these guys are really good. I'm not. Yet they're too nice to fire me. So maybe if I get into some sort of management situation, I can fire myself and replace me with somebody much, much better, which is what happened. And then the band did even better. And that would have been the band that you had mentioned, the Crossroads photo with hundreds and hundreds of people backed up. And that was that band. So yeah, they got a lot better with somebody who could really sing and really play. And there's a long string of great second guitar players or people who really even weren't the second guitar player. They were as good as Jeff,
So Jeff was the only member for the entire run.
Right, all 12 years.
All 12 years for Headstone. And just for folks watching, with Tom's permission, I'll edit this in, but you did an awesome job of sending me information about Headstone and about your career.
Oh, thanks.
And listing bands that Headstone played with, and there were many.
Yeah.
But my favorite photo was, for those who know Cedar Falls, Waterloo, Headstone playing at Crossroads Mall, and it's packed. And the year was, I believe, 1973.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Well, something that picture doesn't show is that at the other end of the mall was my other exclusive band, Dakota. And there was just as big a crowd at that end.
Yeah, that's amazing. Super fun artifacts from that time period.
Well, that was, kind of a heyday of interest in rock bands. That was something that people really liked to do. And there's a lot more forms of entertainment now. So
a question I wanted to ask is, like, what did it mean back then to be a cover band versus what that might mean today?
Well, the difference, I'm going to say, kind of the 90s is the cutoff point. But from the 60s through the 80s, like when I was in Headstone, that's all the band did. They were professional bands, making a living doing it. So to make your living, people want to hear. If you came and played a whole night of original music, you would be playing to an empty hall, first off. Second, it was not unusual to do 4 one-hour sets. In the 90s, you started seeing a lot more of a club where there'd be 2 or 3 bands. They'd only be there one night, and then they'd split the night between them. And so if they're all playing, say, 45 minutes of original material, and by then the audience had also gotten more open about hearing original material. But back then, I can credit a couple of bands with having a lot to do with me wanting to be in the music business, wanting to be a musician. And those are a band from Omaha called the Rumbles. And they basically, 4 people, 4 lead singers who were all outstanding musicians. They could cover anything. I mean, it didn't matter if it was Mamas and the Papas with high female vocals, Hollies, just impossible vocal stuff, and Good Vibrations, the Beach Boys. You listen to that, and it's record perfect, and with huge production as well. And this is in the 60s. The Flippers was a different band altogether. They were out of Lawrence, Kansas, and they were a 7-piece, what you would call show band. But what that meant was they all wore uniforms. The horn players did steps, but they were introducing kids in Northwest Iowa to Wilson Pickett, Midnight Hour, and Mustang Sally, and that was the kind of stuff they played. And they were just outrageously, both of those bands, everybody in it was just a monster. And you go see them, and there'd be 1,000, 1,500 kids at the ballroom, and the first half of the ballroom would be just people standing watching. So it's a different thing. I heard somebody say, like in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Iowa, that a lot of those are just cover bands. Well, if you'd have been there, you'd get it. It was a different world musically, or professionally, I'll say, back then. And both were great. And that cover band thing kind of ended with Nirvana. I saw the whole club scene change, where instead of these bands that were bringing huge production, like Headstone was supposed to play with Marshall Tucker, Climax Blues Band, and Charlie Daniels. Marshall Tucker and Climax Blues Band at McElroy. And the sound and lights were traveling with Marshall Tucker, and they had some kind of a car accident or truck accident, couldn't make it. And so the promoter asked us if we could. So we just went to another band who was friends of ours, Nasty Jack. They had a similar PA. All we had to do was double the PA. We did 10,000 seats with a 10,000 seats with a national act. They had Climax Blues Band at that time. Couldn't Get It Right is a big hit. And they were really good too, and really nice people. Probably the nicest besides Black Oak, Arkansas, that we played with. So it went from, and all the top bands, the Midwestern regional bands, you go see them. It was there was one that was like Alice Cooper with flames and the whole thing. Another band that did prog rock, like cover Yes to a T and stuff like that, huge PAs and lights. And when it got to be original material, you're not going to draw quite as many people, I think. This is kind of my theory. And so it ended up being the band not bringing their own production, because we're not coming from Chicago for gas money, and we're not bringing that too. So when bar owners were responsible for production, PAs and lights, all that went down quality-wise massively. So that's the difference. The ultimate for me, though, as a record producer, recording engineer, that kind of thing, is that because doing that, I spanned both eras. The era of cover bands, and this would have been like the 80s, covering AC/DC and Journey and stuff like that. Those bands, let's say Headstone. Okay, the time they would have to spend working up so they could do a record perfect cover of Hotel California, not easy,
No.
right? And they did. But that's the time that 90s bands had to write songs and work up original stuff. So, and you do get better playing in front of, as far as your musical accomplishment, how good you are on your instrument, you do get better playing in front of people on a regular basis. And the regional bands in the 60s through the 80s were doing that every night for hours. And but here again, no time to write songs. So what I saw then is you get to the 90s and there's not as much musical virtuosity as far as on your instruments, but songwriting way, because the earlier bands, you would play covers most of the night, but you would always try to sneak in one or two originals. And when you don't have that restriction of having to play a bunch of covers, that's all you work on is original stuff. And I felt, I'd done bands that never played a gig that wrote better songs than most of my top bands from earlier. So it's a give and take kind of thing.
Yeah. So let's transition. So you leave Headstone and you start to work for Magnum,
right?
Booking bands, and then you take other steps and become more local. So maybe talk about that.
I didn't become more local. I still was. What happened there is it went great for about a year because I was booking, and there were two other agents in there as well, doing different territories. And the owner, Doug Smith, who was the best guy on the phone I ever heard in my life, he wanted to go off in a national direction, booking national tours. And so he would, he Doug never went for middle of anything. He always went for the top. And there was an agency in New York called Premier Talent. They had Deep Purple, Yes, all the huge bands from back then, all the British, Led Zeppelin, that kind of thing. And there was a guy named Bolander, was it Fred Bolander, was the head agent there. And so Doug just, calls him up. Secretary, no. Well, and so he called him every day for a couple of months. And one day, apparently, when he called him, Bolander was walking past his secretary's desk, and he had been hearing this Doug Smith, hearing her, and he grabbed the phone and said, "Who the hell are you, and what the hell do you want?" And he said, "I want to book a tour for Black Oak, Arkansas." And he talked him into it. And he got 10 days. They gave him 10 dates, and he booked a nice little perfectly routed 10-day tour at places like Central College and Pella and so on and so forth. Well, now Fred's calling him. And he's got this new band that's only had a couple of hits called the Eagles. And so he gave Doug an Eagles tour. Doug is halfway through the Eagles tour when he gets called up to the Army. And so that never materialized. He left. There was literally no agency anymore. And so I'm kind of stranded in Minneapolis. And so in order to stay alive, I just went back in the back bedroom and picked up the phone and started booking bands. And that worked really well. So I thought, but I don't want to do it here. I'm go back to, my top band at that time was Headstone, my old band. And so I came back here to be closer to them. And then Dakota and their manager kept coming up to me and saying, "Look, we're going to be the best band you've got. You won't be able to not book us because we're going to be so popular." And it turns out he was right. Turns out that was Rick Bisbee, who became my partner in Catamount Recording for the whole, I don't know how many years. So at that point, Headstone and Dakota were exclusive bands. In other words, to buy them, you had to call me. And I picked up another band called Judd. And the singer in that band had been the singer in Headstone when I was in it. And he's a phenomenal, Steve McClune's his name, just really talented guy. So he was in Judd. And they were in Florida. They had started out in Rochester, Minnesota, went to Philadelphia, didn't like that, went to Florida, hit big, still didn't want to stay there. So they were coming back to Minnesota, and Steve was kind enough to say, "Look, my old friend has got a booking agency," and I went and saw them. They were totally not commercial, but they were totally incredible. And that's what I was mainly interested in, was incredible. Even Headstone, when they did covers, generally speaking, unless it was something like Hotel California that people saw, they go, "Holy cow, I should do that." If they played top 40, it would be something that was like number 39, so you're kind of familiar, and you get off on it because you've heard it before, but not Jumpin' Jack Flash. Yeah. But so Judd came back to the Midwest, and they became exclusive with me. And so Performers Agency then had signed 3 of the top touring regional bands in the area. One thing that happened that was kind of interesting, there at that time there was a couple of huge agencies in Minneapolis doing the same thing. The difference was they'd have 1 million bands, and I limited to 3 exclusive and maybe half a dozen more that I would toss gigs to. And I can't remember what the name of it is, but there's a festival that all the student activities committees of every college in the 5-state area would come there, and you would have your band showcase for them. And then they would all get together and they would come up with a tour, and we'd tell them that the band normally is twice as much. But if you'll put six dates together in these colleges, then you can have them for half of that, which is still more than we normally get. But I was able to get both Headstone and Judd on, and none of those huge agencies had more than one. And every time I ran into one of them, how the hell did you, So it just, and the answer I would have is I just pick great bands. That's, I believe cream will rise to the top.
So who are some of the bands that you didn't book?
That I didn't book?
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Well, while I had the agency, I was doing all the booking for a few colleges, and generally it was like I'd have to call people and sell them. But there were a few accounts that I had that, like the Circle, where I did all the booking for that and all the promotion, and the Poison Apple was another one. But on Monday nights at the Circle, we would have what major labels refer to as baby bands. They've been signed to Epic Records, but they haven't hit yet, and so they go on tours to try to sell their records. And I got a call from the Allman Brothers agency, and the guy, Southern accent and everything, said, "Well, Tom, I've got this little 3-piece band from England. The record company wouldn't give them any tour support, but they wanted to come anyway. And I got to tell you, they're the biggest sound little band, 3-piece band I've ever heard." And I said, "Yeah, well, send me a record." Oh, man. I'm on the phone so fast. And I already had Ruby Star booked for that night. And I told them I couldn't because I had Ruby Star. And then I'm going to cancel Ruby after I heard that. And I called them and said, "Sorry, we just booked them." They were between St. Louis and Minneapolis, and we would have just been perfect, but they found a gig in the Quad Cities or somewhere like that. And they would have, kind of expensive. The Police would have been $300 back then, and I turned that down. But I didn't know that what was going to happen.
Yeah.
With that.
Yeah. So how did you transition from booking bands to recording bands?
Well, towards the 1978, I got to say booking bands wasn't my favorite thing to do. Made a good living at it, and it was exciting being around those bands, but it wears on you. Basically you get paid to take the blame. Now, the transition to recording. Now, as officially being Headstone's manager, what I saw as the future was, okay, we have to develop original material, and the best way to do that is recording. And so in a rehearsal hall, we acoustified that. We did everything wrong. It was, by textbook bad, but we didn't know. And the manager of Dakota, who I'd worked with, Rick Bisbee, electronics genius, and that's not hyperbole. He is incredible. My contribution to the studio project was I bought a 8-track Tascam 80-8. So it was a unheard of steal compared to what multi-track machines were, in that this was 8 tracks for just $4,000. I can buy a Pro Tools unit for $400. But and his contribution was he designed and built a 16-channel recording console. A real one. And it was good enough that we actually cut our first national record on that. And when we upgraded to 24-track, then we had to get a store-bought one, which was a Yamaha. Didn't sound as good as Rick's. It was harder to get things to sound as good. But so that was my vision, was we're going to have to, at some point, you're going to have to get, anybody will cheer for playing the song Cocaine, but you got to write your own cocaine and get them to make music that will reach people the first time they hear it. I felt that for Headstone to achieve their goals, that was what we had to do. And so we ended up cutting a couple albums worth of material before the band eventually broke up. I think in one of a correspondence to you, I mentioned the date that they broke up. Did you see the significance there?
Isn't that John Lennon?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, John. So the day the band that had been I'd been absorbed with for 12 years, the day that came to an end, John Lennon was killed.
Yeah.
So I had two things died the same day.
Yeah.
And probably not far apart.
Yeah, that was, I think for any music fan or anybody that was like of that era, and I was a little boy back then, but I remember it vividly. I remember
Now you're age.
Yeah,
right?
sorry. I remember walking through the door and seeing that on the TV, walking home from school. So here's as someone who's recorded many bands,
Yeah.
what's the key to getting their best? Like, what's the role of the producer in that process?
Well, the first role is to understand it's not your album, it's their album. And you can have disagreements, state your case, that kind of thing. But in the end, unless they come to accept your point of view and believe in it, you accept theirs and move on. Like I say, it's their name. Mine's on the back, but theirs is on the front in great big letters. This determines their career. It won't be mine. So that's the first thing to understand. It's ironic we're here in the Octopus, which is owned by a real turning point for me in that was doing the Hustle Our Sizes album, My Ass Kickin' Life. I love that name, by the way.
Yeah.
It's but but I already done 2 albums for him, and they, Dave Shrinking Violet that he was. Dave died where the guy who writes the songs and all that he had been holding back. Not really. I'm making this up. Our albums don't sound like we do live. And so we had a pre-production meeting, and he very gently laid that on me. And so I said, well, let's not make this so hard. Let's go out in the studio. Let's set you up like you do when you play live, just like it. No headphones, nothing. Maybe a couple of baffles around the drums to keep the guitars from leaking too much. Let's play like you rehearse, play like you play live, that kind of thing. And what an eye-opener. The minute, you get to a point where you've got all the individual sounds down. And now it's time, okay, let's have everybody play together now. And the difference in their body language from the previous 2 albums when we reached that point to now, I mean, Barb on bass was actually facing her amp and jumping up and down, instead of hearing it through headphones. It was a whole different thing. And over time, I refined that technique to where actually I got it. So you could have a band play totally live without headphones, except maybe the drummer, and not have any significant leakage from the guitars to the drums. Leakage is a big deal because let's say somebody plays something really wrong. You can fix that on his track, but it's in drum overheads already, and so that's a problem. So, but I was able to get it so that you could play live like that, and I felt the band's feel and excitement was just way superior. And when word got out that I was doing it that way, I got way more popular. Turns out bands would rather play like that than amps in separate rooms or baffled off and that kind of thing. Just go out and play like a band. And it actually, my most successful commercially record was Stone Sour. And I had recorded Jim Root and Sean Economaki from Stone Sour before. Jim was also in Slipknot at the time that I recorded him, actually. But I'd done 2 albums with them already that way. And so when Jim and Corey Taylor got there, the record company said, you can do a side project. Jim said, hey, we got to do. And so he sold the rest of the band to come in, and I think that and you might ask my second engineer, John Chamberlain, this, but I think they had recorded that already at another place. They had recorded the whole album on Pro Tools. You know, with you play a riff and then you just copy and paste it 100 times. And they hated the way it turned out. And so that's when I think Jim was able to convince them to come do it with me. At that point, I was still an analog holdout, doing everything on 2-inch tape. And so just that whole session of my ass-kicking life in 1995 changed the way I made records, changed the way I looked at making records, and it made a whole bunch of real good records. So,
what would you say, what gear contributed? You talked about that mixing console,
yeah,
to the records that you created, and kind of how did technology change in your career?
Well, you know, I had a series of, again, when it comes to equipment, Rick Bisbee, back in the 8-track days, it wasn't just the homemade console that he had done that sounded great. He said, you know, what you need is some noise gates. I go, I don't even know what a noise gate is. And he said, well, I'll build you some. So I've got this little rack full of noise gates that shut off tom-tom mics unless you hit them, for example. Okay, that's an advantage. Another disadvantage that little studios like ours had at $25 an hour is the quality of the reverb unit. Most big stuff that you hear, and you've seen programs called plate. Mm-hmm. You know what a plate really is? Plate reverb?
No.
Plate reverb is a sheet of metal, physical sheet of metal, 6 feet wide, 3.5 feet tall, with a speaker driving it in the middle, and a pair of pickups on the left and right. And when you send the send, instead of going to the input of a digital reverb or something, it goes to that speaker, which excites that plate, and it gets picked up and returned to the console by those pickups. And those, at the time, the most popular one was EMT. So if you heard of the Doobie Brothers album, that's what the plate was. Yeah, or say Righteous Brothers, Drowned and Reverb. Those are plate reverbs. They sound incredible. And we had a $750 spring reverb, which is what studios like ours had at the time. And Rick goes, there's no black magic to that EMT plate thing. I can make one of those. I said, really? He said, yeah. So he contacted the guy who ran the studio at the University of Iowa, because they had an EMT plate. And the guy let him in and let him open it up. And he took down all these measurements and all this stuff about it. And he came back and he set out to build one. The plate itself is the stainless steel, such and such a weird number. And so I went to a metal shop and said, look, have you ever heard of this? You see how we got piles of it in the back? It's countertop. and so he built a plate reverb, a copy of an EMT, $7,000 EMT plate, when everybody in our price range is competing with $400 spring reverbs with sprung, and they're dark and all this kind of stuff. And we've got this, plate because of biz. Total cost $750 as opposed to $7,500. And so there's an equipment. At some point went to 16-track for a year. We were able to buy a used one, which that was shot. He refurbished it. And so we cut 16-track for just about a year. And things were going so well, let's go 24. So that meant a new console instead of the biz board. And we got that. We got a 24-track recorder, and then that brought in bigger bands. That's how we got Peter Lorre from Michigan. Their previous album, or their previous recording, they had done a demo with me on 8-track. And the previous recording they had done was with Rick Nielsen producing at a 24-track in Chicago. And they called me up and said, we keep, when we're on the road, and these guys were on the road so much they didn't even have permanent addresses. we're on the road. We keep putting your cassette in instead of the Nielsen one. And I said, well, we just went to 24 tracks. No, actually, that wasn't the 16-track thing. He said, that's what I wanted to hear. Can we do our album with you? And that turned out to be the first record that was picked up on a national label, which the band got totally screwed. And it's just a microcosm of the music record business anyway. But at that point, I went 24-track, and that's when we bought the Yamaha, which was capable of handling 24 channels. And then things went better. Then we got about a $60,000, when it was new, Neotech, great console. Got it out of Bobby Brown's studio, and it was just absolutely trashed. Rick refurbished the whole thing. So we had a $60,000 console for $15,000 because of him. That sounded killer. Higher rates, more people coming from out of state, that kind of thing with that gear. And then when we ultimately built the new studio in the industrial park with the 2-room facility and all that we did Stone Sour in, at that point we still had the Neotech, and that's what Stone Sour was cut on. Direct to analog, again, no Pro Tools, adamant about that. So we still had the Neotech, a great sounding board, but at that point, turns out that record companies are familiar with 3 consoles. One is SSL, which those go for $500,000 a piece. Another one is Neve, $500,000 a piece. And the third one is everything else, including our Neotech. So in order to stay in that stratosphere, we needed to get an SSL, which we found a place that refurbishes them, and we got a used one that originally cost around $500,000, and we were able to. It was again trashed, and so we were able to get it and refurbish it for $100,000. And at that point, that's when I went from analog to Pro Tools, and so that would bring us pretty much up to date. The SSL is still there. The state-of-the-art Pro Tools rig is still there with Travis, the John Chamberlain's successor, as the second engineer, doing a great job. And so I guess that's probably more than you ever wanted to know about recording gear.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to know.
Oh, great.
So of all the bands you captured, and there were many.
You're not going to ask me this, are you?
Were there some that were really memorable? And not to leave anybody out that was important. All that work is important, but
Ralph, every last one of them.
Great answer. Okay. So I do want to ask you about, you were on College Hill for many years. Do you think that location impacted the work? In addition to the gear that was available in the process that you used?
Not so much that it was on College Hill, but that it was a basement, but it was huge. And it was a finished basement. It was under where the bookstore is now. We were under a business called Arts and Crafts. And next to that was the UNI bookstore, U Book and Supply. And and the people who originally built that, who built the basement under that, had it as a billiard parlor. And so it was even though it was a basement, it was finished with nice brick walls and stuff like that. And it was huge. It was almost as big as the one we have in the industrial park now. And so we did have this great big raw space, and that was a beautiful recording studio. I mean, we did a lot of out-of-state bands, all the surrounding states. Being on College Hill, that was also great. Sub City opened right above us. So there was a handy place for people to go to eat, the OP, that kind of thing. I think Omni Tapes and Records was there, so the record stores for them to go.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about your career and your life. I would be remiss if I didn't mention you know, I first learned of your name through many of the bands that you recorded as a teenager. You were not on the front, but your name was on the back of a lot
Do
of
you have
bands
a
that I
favorite,
loved.
Ralph?
I do. Yeah, there were so many bands that I would have loved that you had your hands in. Would have included House of Large Sizes, The Dang Trippers, Full Fathom 5, later on Head Candy. Like those were all bands that I looked at those covers and really saw, hey, something's happening up there.
That Head Candy album is one of my favorites.
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to have a tour of that from someone who worked for you named Carrie Tucker. So I remember that room. So,
yeah.
anyways, I want to thank you for taking the time.
Well, I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.